Welcome to the Adult Bible Study with First Baptist Church of Ray City. My name is Charles. I'm one of our associate pastors, and it's a pleasure to be diving into the book of Isaiah, chapter 53 today. We're continuing on in the Lifeway Explore the Bible material. I hope you enjoy today's Bible study.
Isaiah 53 is probably the most well-known chapter within the book of Isaiah. And this chapter starts by asking us a question: who has believed what we have heard? And this question is directly speaking to and referring to all of God's people who saw the works of the servant. And it's compounded and underscored by the second question: to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? It gives us an understanding of the struggle that the people had at accepting the message and the messenger of this suffering servant. It did not fit the expectations of the people. Thus, the people probably had an extremely difficult time grasping, and we see that through the life of Jesus Christ. People had a difficult time grasping who he was, even though he, being the servant, grew up before them like a young plant. He grew up in their midst. He was before them. And like a root, which the word root typically refers to the line of David out of dry ground. The spiritual state of the people of Israel when Jesus had come was one of dried, parched ground. They did a lot of religious things without being people who were devoted to God's own heart. As David, who Jesus comes from out of the root of David. But yet Jesus didn't come, the servant did not come with any impressive form or any form of majesty that people would look at him. He had absolutely no appearance that was desirable among people. There wasn't anything that people looked at and said, we must follow him. There was no physical honor or royal appearance that would capture the people's attention. There was nothing extraordinary about him. And he was ultimately despised and rejected. He received significant hostility from people. A man whose life was marked by grief and who knew the sickness of humanity, the sickness physically, emotionally, and spiritually. People would frequently turn away from, meaning they would hide their faces from and didn't want any kind of interaction with this servant. And he was despised, and nobody saw the true value that was within this servant. He held no importance in their life. Yet he should have held the most importance in their life. And over these next three verses, from verse 4 through verse 6, we have 7 different ways this suffering servant took our place. The first is that he bore our sicknesses. He bore those ills, the sin that is within us. He carries our pains. But the reaction that we give back to him is we regarded him stricken. The religious leaders of Jesus' day and the people of our own day wrongly and ironically see the suffering servant, the suffering of Jesus, as a punishment against him. They viewed him as stricken and struck down by God, afflicted and hated. But he was pierced because of our rebellion. That's number 3. Literally, the word pierced means to be stabbed. And it's because of our rebellion, our willful defiance of God. He was crushed, both physically or emotionally collapsed is what the word crushed means. He was crushed because of our iniquity. And iniquities, the word iniquities, describes sin as a twisted perversion. He was crushed for our twisted perversion that is within us. The 5th way is he took punishment for our peace was on him. Jesus Christ took the punishment for our sins that we might have relational harmony with God. To sin means that there is a breaking of this relational harmony, and a punishment was what brought harmony back to the relationship. And so Jesus brings our peace back with God. We are healed by his wounds. This likely refers to the spiritual healing and salvation, a very substitutionary atonement, meaning that he took the place and covered over our sin. And the Lord has punished him for the iniquities of us all. The wrath of God is poured out on this suffering servant that is being mentioned through this passage. And the state of all the people is mentioned here in verse 6 in three different ways. We all went astray like sheep. Sheep are prone to scatter when they're not led by a shepherd, aimlessly wandering into danger. And that is the exact inclination of people. We are like sheep. We all have turned to our own ways. We do what we want rather than what God has called us to do. And we are all covered in iniquity, covered in that twistedness of sin, that perversion of sin. This is all of us. This is exactly what Isaiah is bringing forward here in verses 4 through 6. Jesus' death did more than provide an example for his people. He became the substitution who suffered in our place. Let us continue. Verse 7. He was oppressed and afflicted. This word oppressed accurately depicts Jesus on trial, where men in human authority, Pontius Pilate, Cephas, all of them had human authority, and yet they misused their human authority to wrongly accuse Jesus, our suffering servant. Yet he did not open his mouth. He was completely silent, accepting the manner of the servant. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, like a sheep silent before her shears. This phrase is extremely telling, and it ties in with who we are as sheep who are astray. Jesus is a lamb that is led. Lambs and sheep are only led by those who they are comfortable with, their shepherds. And it implies that the people who led the servant were the people who would have been close and held a level of authority over him. His own people, the people of Israel, were the ultimate ones who led him to his death. And the phrase silent before shears, this is another way of saying this exact same thing. The sheared lamb would have, again, been the one who was closest to him, because that would have been the one who would have come to shear and shave off the thick coat of the lamb. And yet Jesus still did not open his mouth. This suffering servant did not open his mouth. He was taken away because of oppression and judgment. Oppression, the root word for oppression, means to restrain or retain. He was bound and led to the cross of Calvary. And then the question comes, this rhetorical question, which has an extremely negative answer. Who considered his fate? It implies no one stopped to think of the servant's unjust punishment. These oppressors, those who've oppressed and those who brought about oppression, they didn't even stop and think about it, about how unjust it was. They just did what they were led to do as they followed their own way. And then this poetic phrase, he was cut from the land of the living, just means that he died. It's a poetic way of saying that he died. And it was because of the people's rebellion. He was struck because of my people's rebellion. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, but he was with a righteous man at his death. Jesus Christ very much fulfills this because of Joseph of Arimathea, who placed Jesus in his tomb. Joseph of Arimathea was a rich and wealthy man, and this points out the paradox between these two things. That the fact that the suffering servant who died for the sins of everyone else, as we saw here, was assigned the grave with the wicked. He had done no wickedness, and yet he was assigned the grave of the wicked. And then we have this paradoxy and this paradoxical situation, which is that he was assigned a grave with the wicked while yet being with a rich man at his death, because he had done no violence and had not spoken deceitfully. His death was completely undeserved, yet he willfully took our place. And now we come to one of the most astonishing sentences, in my opinion, in all the Bible. Yet the Lord was pleased to crush him severely. This is an astonishing statement because it points to the Lord's ultimate plan in crushing this servant. But why did he crush him? The phrase "was pleased" points out the servant's suffering was not just allowed to be, but required as a part of God's perfect redemption plan. The Lord was pleased because it was a part of the plan, which we see ultimately done here when you make him a guilt offering. Why was the servant crushed? To be a guilt offering for the sins of other people, not his own. And Jesus ultimately affirms this in Matthew 26, verse 39, while he's in the Garden of Gethsemane. He walks away from his disciples just a little farther, and then he falls down and he prays, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Jesus fully affirmed the will of God and the plan of God, which is ultimately borne out here, that Jesus Christ, the suffering servant, might become a guilt offering. The servant was provided as a guilt offering, and the servant in effect became the spotless Passover lamb for the forgiveness of guilt. The reward for being offered up in this way is that he will see his seed and he will prolong his days. And this is going to be by the hand of the Lord. And it's the Lord's pleasure will be accomplished. We understand this now in New Testament time. The seed of this person, the seed of the suffering servant, is the church, and his days will be prolonged. This is an extremely astounding resurrection passage pointing to the servant living after being crushed to death. And it's all by the pleasure of the Lord to accomplish his will. The Lord's purpose was never to only crush his servant, but also to give him life after death, so that his even greater purpose of redemption would be fulfilled. Therefore, after his anguish, after the suffering of the servant, he will see light and be satisfied. To see light means the servant would fully perceive God's sovereign plan in not just crushing him and making him a guilt offering, but prolonging his life, raising him from the dead, which would ultimately be the most satisfying thing ever. This knowledge of the full price of what he has done is fully satisfying and rewarding for the servant. And he becomes ultimately satisfied by this knowledge. This righteous servant will justify many. This is the purpose, that justification would come to many people. And he would carry their twisted sin. He would carry and bear their iniquities all the way to the point of death. This is a prophecy that is ultimately fulfilled by Jesus at his cross and through his resurrection. Therefore, what a beautiful phrase that ultimately indicates a transition to the result of what the suffering servant's atoning work has done, and it's borne out in two ways. I will give him the many as a portion. It's way number one, and he will receive the mighty as his spoil. That's way number two. Basically the same two things. Through the victory over sin and death, Christ has now received those who would place their faith in him, and ultimately they would be his inheritance. The word portion here typically refers to and describes some form of inheritance. Those who would place faith in him, those who would trust him for all the work that he has done throughout this entire chapter, throughout his entire life, those who accept him have had their payments, their iniquities, their perverse, twisted sin, everything has been paid for. Because the victor, Jesus Christ, has defeated both sin and death. And then we have a clear statement here at the end of the second half of this verse, of verse 12, because he willingly submitted to death and was counted among the rebels, yet he bore the sins of many and interceded for the rebels. It's a clear doctrine of the atonement. This complex theological topic, which basically means we are now restored and reconciled through the covering of our sins by the blood that was shed on the cross, what we understand now, but basically atonement is restoring and reconciling through the covering of one's sins, through the shedding of blood. We have been atoned because he willfully submitted to death and was counted as a sinner, became sin for us, that he might intercede for us and bore our sin or bear our sin. What a beautiful truth that the one true God is forgiving, and he justifies believers by taking their sin upon himself.
Welcome to the question and answer time. My name is Summer. I'm Pastor Charles's wife, and we're glad you're here with us. I was really excited before I sat down to listen to this study. You said it, that this is one of the, I don't know if you said it was your favorite or kind of most iconic sections of the Old Testament. I've heard stories of people giving their lives to Jesus over reading this in the Old Testament and making the connection that it's Jesus. So this is just a great passage of Scripture, I think, to even understand, I think, on the spiritual side of things and the overall plan of God, what the cross was. In the Gospels, we see the events taking place, but this is almost like the backdrop to all the events. And something that I appreciated from today's study, I have read this countless times, and today is something that I thought about because you were teaching it that I never pondered, was Jesus as the Lamb and how he was being betrayed by those closest to him. To think about God's plan, that not only would he take a people and make a chosen people, but then that he would choose that those chosen people would reject him. I just felt like I could sit and just mull over all of these verses. Like, I feel like I could have just sat for like 10, 15 minutes on each verse and think about it, because sometimes I know that we feel alone in our affliction, and we feel like God doesn't understand what it means, if we have a friend hurt us or a family member, or if we go through something, it's like the person that hurt us was so close. And here it's like he understands more than we can fathom. Not only did he create, but he chose, and then they rejected. And so I guess I would love your thoughts of how can we take this, Isaiah wrote, 6,000 years ago, however long ago it was. How do we take what Jesus went through, this plan of God from the foundation of the world, and how do we apply it to our lives? Is there an area that stuck out to you, like how I saw with those closest to Jesus?
The whole passage is, obviously it's really pivotal in our understanding of the grand scheme, the grand redemptive plan of what God is doing. Probably the thing that really stuck out to me was that verse 10, like that, so iconic and yet so astonishing and astounding. Like it almost feels like it shouldn't be there because it seems wrong on first, like as you first think of it. That yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. Or as the CSB, which we studied, it pleased the Lord to crush him, or to severely crush him. Like that sounds so wrong to think of. But I like the way that the ESV writes it here. It says, it was the will of the Lord to crush him. It was God's plan to do it. And why did he do it? To put our grief, our sorrow, our burden, our iniquity, all on him, that he might then take him and raise him up. So he crushes him. It was the will of the Lord to crush him. And when his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring, or seed as the CSB puts it, and he shall prolong his days. Like from 2,000 years or so before Jesus steps onto the scene, Isaiah prophesies not only that the Lord would crush the suffering servant, but then that the Lord would raise the suffering servant up, that he might prosper. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall prolong his days. Like the resurrection, the atoning sacrifice, the guilt offering. Verse 10 is
it is such a culmination of all of those things.
Yeah.
And yet, our initial reaction in hearing something like that most likely is one of, how did the Lord do that?
Yeah.
And that puts us right back at the very beginning, where we're sitting there with the people of his day not even recognizing, not having any understanding, and being in complete denial of who Jesus Christ, who this suffering servant truly is.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think of the verse, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. And if this was the eternal plan, that he would die before anything, before Adam and Eve sinned, he knew he was going to come to die, because he knew what was going to happen. It just makes me think, even I've heard it said before, when people really start to grasp that Jesus died and on our behalf, I've heard people say things like, well, I wish he didn't have to die, or I wish that didn't happen. But I think when we truly understand the cross, like, we can't say, I wish that never happened, because if it hadn't happened, there's no hope.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus says in Matthew, like, Lord, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but your will be done. Like, he completely affirms all of what verse 10 says right there.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you combine verse 10 with verse 6 from chapter 49, which was the last study that we did,
yeah,
it is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribe of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you as a light for the nation, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, most likely you who are watching this are not Jewish by descent. And that means that what Jesus did covers not only the Jew, but also the Gentile. Romans 1:16. It's the power of God unto salvation. First to the Jew, then to the Gentile. It covers the entire world. And my encouragement to you, if you are listening to this, if you're thinking these things through, and you have not made that public profession of Jesus Christ, that you would see what Jesus Christ has done for you. See how he has borne your sin, your iniquity, the twisted perversion of your own wickedness. And you might not even think that you're wicked, but we are all self-bent and turned in on ourselves. And so I want to encourage you, if you're watching, to think about these things, to see what Jesus Christ has done for you, to see that it was the plan of God to crush his son and then raise him up that he might have reward. As verse 11 and 12 talk about, that the righteousness of his servant would come up, and that it would make many to be accounted righteous, and it would be the reward of the servant to satisfy him. Like, it was all for his joy and all for his glory and for our salvation. So I encourage you, accept Christ today. And if you have accepted him, relish in what Jesus Christ has done for you and for me and for us, the entire world, if we would accept his offer of salvation. We are so excited to be able to do this each week with you, and we look forward to doing this again with you next week.